closing months of 1933, before the government had even approved the construction of a new ship, the Imperial Japanese Navy secretly ordered the Kure Naval Arsenal to begin manufacturing the frames and hull plates for the G8 design. This order would end up being a mistake, however. By the opening months of 1934, a series of Japan's latest warships were having a series of issues with construction and stability. Ultimately, on March 12, 1934, a torpedo boat would capsize in heavy seas, and this would see the formation of an investigation committee who would rework the calculations for stability within the Imperial Japanese Navy. This would see a lot of recent constructions being reworked in the upper half of the ships, particularly in the superstructure and armaments, while new designs that had yet to be built were completely thrown under the table and reworked. This would see the flying deck cruiser G8 turned into the fully fledged fleet aircraft carrier G9. Though the Japanese might not have noticed it at the time, G9 would be the foundation of their aircraft carrier designs until the end of the Imperial Navy in 1945. Now, Japanese designers were very cunning when creating G9. They were already aware that G8's frames and hull plates had begun production, so they decided to use the same base structure so these components could still be used in G9's construction. With that being said, the Japanese designers still had plenty of work ahead of them, since once the Navy accepted G9's design for construction, they were already ordering another ship to follow up G9, and this would be labeled G10. The Imperial Navy had just learned a ton of information about aircraft carrier construction through the newly reconstructed Kaga and the newly accepted G9 design, and thus they wanted to improve upon G9 to see how much better they could make this so-called medium-sized aircraft carrier. Now, earlier I said that all Japanese aircraft carriers following G9 would follow its basis of design. G10 is included in this. However, the improvements of G10 would see construction in future aircraft carriers largely unchanged. However, this isn't to say that G10 was superior to G9 in every aspect. The next type of medium carrier to follow these up would be the G16 design, and it was effectively a G10 hull with G9 accessories. Now, that statement should not be taken at 100%, as it's not exactly what's happening. However, I'm going to explain the designs of these three ships so that there's a better understanding. The first improvement G10 had over G9 was heightening the bow and stern to increase seaworthiness of the vessel. This means that G10's freeboard was approximately half a meter more than G9 on average. The next improvement would be an attempt to increase the maneuverability of the ship on G10 in comparison to G9, and the way this would be done was by altering the type of rudder being used. On G9, there would be two spaded rudders angled outward at approximately 19 degrees, while G10's design would have a single centerline balanced rudder. Now, this so-called improvement was actually a failure on G10's part. A variety of ships outside of these two designs would be testing these types of rudder designs, and the Japanese would find that larger ships did better with the dual spaded rudders, while smaller ships, like destroyers, did better with the single balanced rudder. Another improvement would be important connections and joints would be riveted on G10 while they were welded on G9. Now, I know this sounds backwards, but we must remember that in the 1930s, electric welding was a brand new technology, and the Japanese had just adopted it for ship construction in that decade. And due to a series of structural issues with ships that they had done full welding on, they were rather weary of the new technology, and thus they resorted back to the solidified method of riveting, since they knew how this would react in day-to-day service. The next improvement to be incorporated would be increasing the thickness of the armor belt and armor deck for rather obvious reasons. This would create a massive challenge for the designers. The size of these two ships were largely unchanged, and this meant that the stability calculations were almost identical between the two. Increasing the armor throws the stability off, creating a top-heavy vessel, so the Japanese had to stretch the numbers as carefully as possible to not capsize the ship. This means that the armor belt on G10 is approximately 10 millimeters thicker on average, and the deck is approximately 15 millimeters thicker. The Japanese Navy still regarded both of these vessels as highly vulnerable to any type of weapon, and thus the increase of armor is to be considered a failure. The next improvement we're going to look at is also a failure, since the range of G10 was supposed to be increased from G9. However, this was not achieved, and their ranges were about the exact same. The final improvement, which is the most obvious to the naked eye, is the island placement and design. On G9, the island was very small and constrictive to the people working within it, and it was located on the starboard side approximately 1/3 of the distance back on the flight deck. On G10, the island's size would be increased to make it a more comfortable command spot, but the placement this time would be on the port side, about 1/2 of the length of the flight deck back. The aircraft carrier Akagi would be the only other aircraft carrier in the Imperial Navy to have this island placement, and pilots disliked it compared to the starboard placement, and thus all future Japanese carriers would have the island on the starboard side, approximately 1/3 of the length back. Now that we've discussed the major design differences, it's time to stop beating around the bush. On November 20th, 1934, the keel to G9 was laid down at Kure Naval Arsenal, and this ship would later become the Soryu, while G10's keel would be laid down on July 8th, 1936, at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, and this would later become the Hiryu. These two ships would eventually come to form Carrier Division 2, and they would operate together for their entire lives, and they would ultimately see their ends together at the Battle of Midway. However, these two ships laid an egg and left offspring, and this is the G16 design. G16 is largely just the Hiryu's hull and flight deck design. However, instead of having the island on the port side, it is on the starboard side, and the rudder design goes back to the Soryu's dual spaded rudders, completely dumping the single balanced rudder. The first ship to the G16 design would be laid down on August 1st, 1942, almost a year after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and this would become known as the Unryu. It was supposed to be followed up by 15 more ships to its design, with minor improvements. A total of 5 more ships to the G16 design would be laid down, with only 2 more being completed. 2 ships would be cancelled before their construction even began, and the rest of the ships would be cancelled as World War II came to a close, and it was obvious the carriers would never be built. The history behind these ships seems very flip-floppy and messy, and that's because it was. The Japanese were unsatisfied with the so-called medium-type carrier design, as it just couldn't fulfill the air groups, the armor protection, the range, and the armaments that they wanted their carriers to possess, with the best examples being the Shokaku and Zuikaku. Those were the ideal perfect carriers. To word it best, the medium-type carrier was a quantity over quality method of production. With that being said, that is all I have to say on the topic for today. So, if you have enjoyed today's video, why not leave a like and comment down below, and have a wonderful day.